right, welcome everybody. We're gonna give ourselves about 3 more minutes and then we'll start the program. So thank you everyone for showing up and hopefully you enjoy what we'll be discussing today. All right, so let's go ahead and start. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Corey Gaither. I'm an alumni of Cal Poly Pomona. I sit on the board of the Cal Poly Pomona Black Alumni and Friends chapter, and then I also sit on the board of the Cal Poly Alumni chapter as well. So thank you everyone for joining us this evening for the Cal Poly Pomona Black Alumni and Friends Workshop, Student-Centered Learning 101. This event will be recorded, so please feel free to share this discussion with your colleagues by visiting the Cal Poly Pomona alumni page, which it will be posted on. Our recent programs have been workshops aimed at discussing the current social ills that we face today. Previously, we had one on the digital divide, and Professor Hurd III moderated, and we discussed social learning and the challenges for students, educators, and parents to gain resources and adapt to online learning. This evening, Professor Hurd III will join us along with the African American Museum of Beginnings to discuss student-centered learning. We will have Q&A at the end, but you're welcome to ask questions in the chat box, or feel free to verbally ask your questions by using the reaction button at the very center of the screen. If the hand raise symbol isn't there, please feel free to use the thumbs up to indicate you have a question. The moderator will unmute you and then you'll be able to state your question verbally. So with that done, let me go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Elgrie Jones Hurd III holds a master's degree from San Jose University in sociology with an emphasis in sociology of education. He also has a bachelor's degree from Cal Poly Pomona University in sociology. For 2 decades, Elgrie has worked in education in some capacity. He has served as an adjunct professor, middle school and high school teacher, a student service dean, an upward bound coordinator, and even a consultant staff member for faculty training, student leadership development, tutor training, and overall academic support. He is currently an adjunct faculty member of the Brookhaven College in Dallas, where he joins us from right now, Criswell College, Messenger College, Parker University, Strayer University, and Tarrant County College. Over the last 10 years, Elgrie has traveled around the country educating educators and parents about the power of culturally relevant education. Currently, Elgrie specializes in educational consulting, motivational speaking, and organizational program evaluations. Elgrie is pursuing his doctorate degree in psychology with an emphasis in industrial organizational psychology. His goal is to use his studies to develop strategies to enhance emotional intelligence, awareness of students at all levels of education. Please welcome Professor Hurd III.
All right, well, thank you very much, appreciate it. Today, the hope is to is to be there to support educators, those who aspire to be educators, on how can we put students back at the center of the learning experience. Because if we're being honest, too often learners aren't at the center. We have certain mandates, certain standardized tests that have to be taken care of. And while all those things are important, all the research shows that when you put students at the center of the conversation, where their interests, their needs are addressed, you're likely to deal with all the other things that you're mandated to have students learn. So I appreciate those who are able to be here today. Like I said, for me, a lot of lessons I've learned as it relates to education experience and student learning comes from my experience when I was at Poly Pomona. And so wanting to share that with those who are part of the alumni, who are part of the alumni, who are friends of Poly Pomona, and hopefully getting something useful. So that being said, let's talk about student-centered learning 101 and get started. So if you can go on to the next slide, please. So when I started every session, I kind of want to give some things to make sure we're on the same page about some expectations of things that we're going to cover today. So we'll talk about define critical theory, how that relates to student-centered learning, which is the foundation of anything that I will be sharing with you all today. We'll identify 1 or 2 strategies for educators to gather information from students to be student-centered. We want to be mindful of our time, so we want to give you some practical things you can utilize. Next slide, please. We're also going to talk about ways to apply it. So I want to give you some tangible examples. Just don't want to talk simply about theories, but talk about ways we can apply these in a real life setting. And so to use that, I will be using some things that I've used in an academic setting in my formal teaching, but also in my experience in colleges and as a homeschool teacher of my own children. All right, next slide, please. So for those who are on this call, whether you're on this call to encourage someone else to use this information later, something that's really important is the idea that if you're serious about doing student-centered learning, it's going to require work. It's going to require you to put in extra time. And I can tell you from working in education the last 20 years, it's totally worth it. It's totally worth it because it makes the work you do in the long term more effective. And in some ways, it makes it easier because it's not a guessing game. By putting students at the center, it's going to require you to maybe do research that other people aren't doing, and that's okay. So I want to put that disclaimer out there because I think that's really important in how we're having these conversations. Okay, next slide, please. So critical theory. Critical theory gets its roots in different things. And one of those includes a book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed, written by a Brazilian scholar. And one of the things that he focuses on in critical theory is students need to be at the center of learning. They're more likely to be engaged with what they have to master. Now, this isn't a new concept. This has been done throughout the history of education, of educating others. When you find ways to tangibly connect them to things that matter to them, they're likely to hold on to things that you need them to know. And so what happened in Brazil was not that it was new, but that it was just documented, this idea of putting students at the center. And students, regardless of their social economic status, were able to thrive in learning environments. And so I've seen that. I have seen where you're dealing with kids who are in 9th grade, who I've seen have better critical understanding of analyzing the world than some of my grad school counterparts. Where I had a young man, I gave them an assignment. I said, you can pick any film you want. It was a high school sociology class, 9th grade. And I said, pick any film you want. And I want you to tie it into a sociological concept. The concept was deviance, how you break away from the norm, whether for good or for bad. And this 9th grader wrote this well-written breakdown of Scarface from the 80s that starred Al Pacino, and how that movie perpetuated certain things and that impact on people who were trying to aspire to do great things who didn't have all of the economic resources. His paper was written better than some of the students I had who were taking undergraduate classes with me years before. What made him successful was throughout the semester, we showed that the things that he cared about related to the things that he had to know. And that's what critical theory is about. Critical theory is about putting students at the center. But to do that, you have to know what they want. So, next slide, please. So to do that, there are two ways of collecting information. You can do it formally. If you're in a K-12 setting where you're typically seeing students throughout the entire year, a formal survey may be worthwhile. In that formal survey, or even if you have a small class under 20 students, a formal survey where you're asking them their name, what they like to go by, asking about how they get around, how they get to school, how many siblings they have, who do they live with, what are the hobbies, you're asking them so that you know how to tie in the things you have to cover to the things they need to know. Now that survey may be one page, it might be an oral survey where you talk to them. In situations where I teach anywhere between 9 to 12 classes a semester, well, for me, that's going to be an informal survey. At the beginning of every class of my semester, I ask students, what do you want to get out of this class? That's what I asked them on the first day of class. What do you want to get out of this class, even in my online classes? And once I've gotten that information, I take it back to my office and I figure out how do I need to tweak the class for the rest of the semester. And throughout the semester, I'm continuously asking them questions. So while in a K-12 setting, I might do that formal survey at the beginning or get all that information up front. Throughout the semester in a college setting, I'm typically asking those questions a little piece at a time throughout the semester. And for each unit that I'm covering, I am using that prior information, that prior knowledge of the students. And so when students are asking, why are we going this direction in class? I inform them they are at the center of the things that we're discussing. Your input determined the direction of this class. And by doing that, it doesn't become a classroom that I am leading. I am more of a support system and facilitating. The students are leading the conversations because it's things they've invested in. It's things that matter to them. So those are the things that we push forward in a formal survey and informal survey. You may find yourself doing a little bit of both. It depends on your flexibility and things you have available to you, but those are things that I have utilized in the past that have been quite helpful. Next slide, please. So for me, I have 4 children. I have one that is now in 8th grade. I have one that is in 5th grade, one is in 4th grade, and one is 4 years old. And so far, he has not interrupted our call just yet, but he is notoriously for finding a way to make himself into the crowd and wave at you all. So before you walks in here and waves hi, don't be surprised. That is the life of trying to teach in a pandemic with 4 kids, and one kid doesn't care. Over the years, my family was homeschooled for 6 years. My wife and I, we homeschooled our kids. It wasn't because we lost faith in the public school system. It's just because the amount of time we were at the school, we felt that we could do much more with our kids at home. And so we homeschooled our kids. We taught our kids how to read. We taught our kids math. We taught our kids history and science. And one thing that we did do that is we started to learn things that they were interested in. So what you see on your screen is, it says Hamilton vocabulary. For some of you, maybe you've seen the Hamilton musical. Some of you haven't. Long before it made to Disney Plus, my family had been listening to that musical probably for the last 3 years. We listened to it over and over and over again. My kids knew every word to every song in both acts of the musical. And there are a lot of different reasons why the Hamilton musical is useful in an educational setting. It's a history lesson. It ties in music. It ties in hip hop explicitly. It talks about different things relates to racism, which are still things that we're dealing with today, systematic issues, elitism, all these different things. Now to a kid who 3 years ago was 10, doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. And so using critical theory, we use that as a beginning stage. On the left side of the screen, there's actually about 40 vocabulary words. On the right hand, it doesn't show, this is a screenshot, it shows about 25. And that was for my oldest and my second oldest. And my third oldest had the second list as well. And so what we did was we went through these words, but we had to make sure they had context. And so since my kids enjoyed the musical so much, we decided to turn the Hamilton musical into our own curriculum. And so with that, we used the words of Hamilton and we gave it cultural context. That's also part of critical theory, that the culture of the learner is quite important. So with each word you have here, quagmire, listless, proclamation, prodigy, my children had to figure out what was the context of those words. So they listened to the song. They would listen carefully. We would print out the lyrics of the song, have them act it out. They would lip sing essentially the verses and make sure they're acting it out. And we would talk about that to build the context. Over the course of about 1.5 years, we went through all these different sets of vocabulary words and we looked at how to say them. We utilized the dictionary so they could learn how to say each word, how to break it down by syllables, to understand the definition, to understand the context and seeing if the definition in the dictionary matched the definition as to how it was used. And that was quite important. So we went through those things. And from there, once they understood it, it wasn't just that they experienced listening to the Hamilton musical. They experienced something that was important to them and it taught them. It increased their vernacular. They were saying words that most kids that I had taught them in school were not saying. And that helped them be able to dissect other things, looking at historical documents. So we'll go to the next slide. So we went from, once they had mastered the vocabulary, we gave them they had to put the vocabulary list in alphabetical order. Now to do that, we had to make sure that we explain what that was. So one thing that's important in any type of learning, whether it's student-centered learning or just learning in general, is modeling what you expect of your students. So I would do it, then we would do it with them, and then we'd give them a chance for them to do it on their own. So before we asked them to to do the alphabet, we broke that down, and that's important. And we defined all the words. And we talked about why culture is important. We talk about student-centered one-on-one and talking about how important culture is. We wanted to give definitions that fit things that mattered to them. We didn't want them just to have the dictionary definition. We didn't want them just simply to have the definition of what has references related to Hamilton. We want to talk about how those words fit into how they understood the world. We wanted them to understand that their interpretation was just as important as what they saw in the dictionary. We had them write sentences, but not just sentences of just to check the box, but sentences that mattered to them. Give me this word as it relates to something that you understand. So when we're talking about the quagmire, my teen at the time was talking about the quagmire of not being able to play the video game when he wanted and try to get his work done, how to adjust to that. That was important. Having them write paragraphs, using and telling stories, showing that those words can transcend the way they are interpreted, which was a great segue for us to talk about the history of hip hop and how hip hop was a fusing of rock, blues, R&B, jazz, coming together to tell a story about communities, primarily people of color and low income, to tell their story in a country that tends to marginalize and ignore them. And for them to see the commonalities and to see that what they recognize as a Black voice can come in many shapes and form, which is important because the experience of any group of color, we're talking about Black, African Americans, Latinos, is going to have a continuum of experience. And just because one's on the far end of the spectrum doesn't mean it's not as valid as someone on the other end of the spectrum or somewhere right down the middle. And then we talked about spelling, and we talked about different ways of breaking that down. And so with these, we were able to equip them to do something that they understood and they appreciated. Now, what's not on here is we worked on things that they needed to work on anyway, how to speak. So they had to speak the lyrics of the songs of the musical in the same time as it was played in the actual musical. So if the song's really fast, they had to work on being able to read and speak out loud, which is important for their oral communication skills. Now, that's not something that they were thinking about, but again, that's something that if you look at some of the expectations of kids, elementary school kids, those are things that they want to work on. So we use what they knew to master something that the state eventually wanted them to demonstrate that they understood. So next slide, please. So when it comes to applying and reapplying, skill mastery leads to confidence. We wanted them to know that they could do all the stuff that the schools may eventually ask of them, but we started with building their confidence. And critical theory of learning looks at if you put everything that's important to students at the center, they are more likely to have confidence in taking on new and unfamiliar things because they have a strong foundation. This is similar for those when you train them for sports, things like that. So we took our time to encourage them to understand and master Hamilton, at the same time using that to talk about other aspects of their identity as Black children in the United States to build their confidence. So when they had to read things, it led to their confidence leads to meeting mandated learning outcomes. They were able to read books that they weren't familiar with because they were able to look at the context clues similarly as they did with the Hamilton. And that's what's important. You show them, you meet them where they are to get them to where they need to get to. And that's an essential foundational piece of critical theory. So regardless of the ethnicity, racial background that you are equipping a student for, you first want to build their confidence in what they know. If you build in what they know, they're likely to be successful in taking on everything else because you show them you already know how to do this. It looks a little different, it sounds a little different, but it's still based on the training that you already have the confidence in doing. So those are just some simple tips of ways to do that. In other aspects I've used, we're talking about reading, writing, using hip hop, using songs that the students had shared with me based on their survey to create, printing out the lyrics of their songs, breaking those songs down and finding out the mood, the tone, the theme, and building up their confidence by using several of the artists they know to be able to break down Shakespeare or other commonly used curriculum in English language arts classes. So again, that confidence is key. That confidence comes when you validate the student. And critical theory is all about, at the end of the day, the student teaches the teacher how to teach them. And that's important because by doing that, the student is invested in the learning process. And students learn better when they care about what they have to learn. So next slide, please. So I know we're going to have a formal question and answer session after the Museum of the African American Beginning does their presentation. But I want any questions that you all had based on what I shared. And you can put that in the chat or I believe the facilitators can take you off and unmute you.
I just had a comment, and that is that what you shared is right on time for what we need to get out to our communities. The what you shared with having the students be the center, it's like, steering the boat, it's like we as individuals have to learn about our bodies and our health in order to allow our health practitioners to really help us. We have to be really involved in order to really be helped physiologically. So I appreciate what you shared.
Thank you for that feedback. That's really important. We have to encourage the learner to really to get to know themselves, to embrace themselves, to explore. By discovering more of who they are, they'll be more impactful in what they want to do. Too often in school settings, we want kids to know what they want to do, but we've given them no opportunities to invest in themselves, into how this is going to lead to other things. My son, I had no idea that my son was into books as much as he is. He was so into books that he would take books in my library and he would reorganize them. And it wasn't until we allowed him to just do those kind of things, we recognized that he wants to be a librarian. He enjoys helping people in that regard. And for the last 5 years, he stuck with that. You know, teaching, talking about the Hamilton musical helped my daughter understand her passion for fashion. And now she's looking at things that matter to her and how to incorporate that by reading up on fashion that matters to her. And we use that to help her understand history, mathematics, and other things that she's going to have to know to be successful in that industry. Okay. Next slide, please. So whether you're going to look at the share YouTube video later, I have my information there that has my cell and my email. If I can be a resource, because we're on limited time here, so it's more that I'd love to share, but we're on limited time here. So if there are things that you would like to know more about, things you'd like me to give you some more tangible templates, I'd be happy to do so. That is my information there. And I appreciate you all for the time of letting me share what I had to give to you this evening.
I have it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again. Applause for Professor Hurd III. Thank you again. We now will go into we'll do a deep dive more into the cultural aspect of student-centered learning, specifically for African Americans. Some of the best resources for parents and educators to appeal to students of color or a diverse background are museums. So with that, I'll introduce the co-founders of the African American Museum of New Beginnings. We have Khalif Anderson Gordon Rashawn. He's the co-founder, president, curator. Khalif came to Pomona as a teenager and as a lifelong learner who has immersed himself. Cultural awareness, education are top priorities for Rashawn. A retired Pomona Unified School District teacher for many years, it was during his teaching career that he became frustrated with the omission and outright distortion about the history and culture of underrepresented people. The AAMB has been a vision of his for over 20 years, and its actualization is a dream come true. Khalif's strong dedication and ability to inspire, lead, and his skills in establishing and maintaining relationships with public and private funders and partners serves the museum well. Khalif holds a master's in education from Azusa Pacific University and a bachelor's of arts in sociology from the University of Laverne. Next, the other co-founder, Victoria Rashawn. Victoria grew up in South Los Angeles and later migrated to the Inland Empire. She has spent nearly 40 years in education, first as a tutor, later as a teacher for the Pomona Unified School District. Upon retirement, her husband, community leader, and herself created the African American Museum of Beginnings. The community was concerned about the lack of African American history being taught in our schools, so the birth of the museum was a necessity. She was Teacher of the Year for the Pomona Unified School District in 1999, and most recently was honored for her work with the museum by the Pomona chapter of the Council of Negro Women. Her hobbies include line dancing and quilting. Victoria holds a master's in education also from Azusa Pacific University and a Bachelor's of Sociology from the University of Laverne. Please welcome Victoria and Khalif.
Okay, this is an honor and a great opportunity to be here and be able to absorb the information that we're receiving and giving, because that's part of the learning process. I'd like to start out with trying to remember our mission, our short mission statement. The mission of the African American Museum is a virtually self-funded community museum that inspires all on the history and the culture of African and African Americans. And in a nutshell, what it has evolved to is our program affecting healthy Black families in a nutshell. And so I have to make sure that I keep that in mind in all the things that we do. Now I have a slide presentation that we're just going to show some things and important things that we have found out. And we are learning a little bit on how we have learned how we can inject this into the learners that come to the museum by Professor Hurd III. Okay, so we have to collaborate on how we can use what we have and make sure that we're able to maximize this learning opportunity. Next slide, please. African American Museum of Beginnings presents. Next slide. Okay, I have this here because I want us to keep in mind and focus of what we need to do from where we have come as Black folks, African people, and taken from Chains and Images of Psychological Slavery by Professor Naim Akbar. Next slide. Or Menacide of the African Mind, and that is really what has happened to us. And it's really, really critical that we keep this in mind as we do our work within our community. Next slide, please. Okay, when we talk about Menacide, I have an example. On the right, you see the Moor, which represents the Moorish civilization or African civilization that invaded the Iberian Peninsula in 711 to 1492. There was a insurgence of culture and technology and science that was unknown in Europe and transformed the Iberian Peninsula. On the left, this represents the Reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula, and it represents the killing of the Moorish civilization, or looking at today, the Black male. So if you look in some of the works of Signs and Symbols, you will find this. And this was, I don't want to belabor this, so I'm going to move on a little bit more quickly. So let's suffice that to be that way. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, enslavement was very, very instrumental in the position that we're in right now. Okay, a lot of people say just get over it. It's over now. Well, it's not over. 14 years of psychopathic racial terrorism that has not stopped. That has not stopped. You know, the psychotic rape of men, women, and children, the forced incest of our people, and the fact that we were trained to serve for 400 years. Next slide, please. Keeping that in mind. How does this menacide manifest today? Next slide, please. We go back to 1954, and Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark, they did what we call the doll test. And that had to do with the Brown versus Board of Education and seeing what segregation does to people. The doll test was, which doll will Black children choose? Next slide. We see The white doll was overwhelmingly chosen. Next slide represents another of the same. I remember my sisters during Christmas time, there was no such thing as a black doll. Well, not that we knew of. Next slide. Contemporary experiment, same thing. Okay. And the same outcome. So that means that we're still suffering from this menticide. Next slide. This is how it manifests. These are examples. You see Mr. Rodman, Mr. Jackson. You have our baseball star. What's his name? I'm under pressure right now. So, but you can see what living here does on a daily basis. You know, it's like I got to get out of the skin, not being comfortable in our skin, not seeing the beauty of what we are. Next slide, please. And I'm gonna go really rapidly, okay? So we're also African American Museum of Beginnings presents, next slide, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. Okay, what do we do in order to bring about healthy families, healthy children? The last visitations we had to the museum by a high school, we had about 25 students in the grand room, and we had them all day on a field trip. And this was it was very interesting because I just read a book called The Education of the Negro. Okay, and this book talked about from 1619 to 1865, the education of Africans in slavery and out. And the education was simply to teach them as much as they knew in order for them to be trained to work, okay, and to read the Bible. Next slide. Okay, so there is something missing, and we call it at the museum, among my peers, this is a stolen legacy, that if we knew as a people and other people knew also what the truth was in this history of the ourselves, and other people would also. Next slide. Okay, this represents the first people on the planet. We're talking about Lewis and Mary Leakey. They did their finds in the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. Next slide. Next slide represents the peopling of the planet. If you look at Africa, you see that the world, these lines represent how every continent was peopled by people. And those people, those human people, were African people, Black folk, that we are all connected to. So therefore, we are all cousins. We are all related. Next slide. Okay, this represents a find in what we know as France. As I said, that first people, you dig deep enough, you're going to find your cousins that are African. Okay. Now this is known as Venus of Wallendorf, and she was found. This statue was found at the 30,000 year strata in the Earth. That's the dating of this piece. Okay. So what you will find is all over the planet something similar. Next slide. Okay, this represents the Nile Valley civilization. And this is very, very important for us as Black folk to know that when you think of Egypt, when you think of Ethiopia, and those kingdoms throughout Africa, those were African kingdoms of the technology and the science, that we have to make sure that we let our children know that this advanced society was created by Black folk. Next slide. Okay, more of the people we basically in history books, when they have history divided, you have Egypt in one chapter and Africa in another, because they want to continue the propaganda that this was not the work of African people. Okay, so I have it broken down in the regions. Asia, next slide. Okay, what we have here are some pictures of I would say, contemporary African people in the Philippines. They are known as Negritos. I haven't learned how to pronounce their indigenous, what they call themselves. But when you look at these people, you're basically looking at the seed people of the planet. These are the people that populated the planet. Okay, we generally look at Filipinos as being a light-skinned group of people, but what we see when we look at modern Filipinos are a mixture of Chinese, Japanese, Puerto Ricans, Africans, and these are people that were brought and amalgamated in the work on that particular country. Okay, continue. Next slide. Yes, this represents the Shang Dynasty, and it represents the first dynasty of China. And there are a lot of finds in different areas within China that represent this first dynasty. If you look at the baby in his mother's mouth, you can see what is known as anthropologically the term with the mouth that most Black people have, that mouth, the jaw, mandible, maxilla, is prognathism. And so anthropologists, they look at this trait to see and determine the ethnicity or or where these people came, that are origin, where they came from. Okay, next slide. We think of Siddhartha Gautama or the Buddha as being a typical Asian person, but this person came from the Indus Valley civilization, and he was an African, okay, as well as someone named Krishna. Okay, so keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, pardon me, Japan. Okay, it is said in the writings of the people there, the original people, the Ainu, that after the change in the movement of other people in the area, we have the samurai. In order to be a great samurai, you have to have African blood. Next slide, please. Okay, go into the religious aspect. Historically, when you look at the Christ figure of Christianity, the first images you see are always African. If you look on the left, you see a picture of Yeshua, better known as Jesus. On the right, you have Justinian, the Byzantine emperor, and you see that he is plainly a Caucasian. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the ancient picture of Yeshua as well. Next slide. Europe. Next slide. Okay, this is known as the Black Madonna. There are countless pictures of these, and you have to Google it. Okay, and it's a continuation. Back in the day, in the ancient times, when you thought of or you saw pictures of the Christ figure, that person was always African. Next slide. Okay, this is Saint Maurice. This is an example of a person that is from Africa, that became a Roman general. He was sent to Germany and to subdue the German tribes, but because he was a Christian and they were Christians, he chose not to attack his Christian brethren, and so therefore he was killed and all of his men by the Romans. Okay, so today in Germany he's a patron saint. And so next slide. Now we look at our history, and now this is what happens oftentimes. This is also Saint Maurice. Okay, I went to a church in Pomona. I thought I don't know what I expected, but there's a Pomona church right outside of Cal Poly, and it's the Church of Saint Maurice. So I went in there, I said, oh, these people must be conscious and they know the truth, but that was not true. Okay, next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, when you look at Europe, and if you've seen Braveheart or this film, The Centurion, the true history is that these people were tribes of African people called the Picts, P-I-C-T. The first king of Scotland was a Pict. His mother was a Moor and his father was a Pict. And so I'm not going to read this. I'm going to go on by. Next slide, please. And I'm going really fast for the discussion. These are some of the images that came out of Britain, and wasn't too much here. On the right, you find a lot of this information in ancient, modern Britons by David McRitchie. He wrote this in the 19th century. Okay, and on the next slide, this is another example of one of the artifacts found in Scotland area. Notice the locks of the brother. Okay, there's a lot of history that is hidden, obfuscated. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the coat of arms of Kenneth MacAlpin, the first king of Scotland. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to show you a series of coins. I'm not going to really comment on them other than these are just coming to light historically. Okay, and in certain pictures also of people, there was an African presence in Europe. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Okay, musicians, these are before Renaissance. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is very important work here. This African presence in North America 2,000 years before Columbus, made famous by Dr. Ivan van Sertima. He wrote his book 41 years ago, and it represents the African presence or the visitation of Africans to Yucatan Peninsula. And there are just many artifacts. These are, I would say 15 to 50 tons, some of these heads. Okay, the top one in a place called Tres Zapotes in the Yucatan Peninsula, and then various other ones. Next slide, please. Okay, now these are inventions by Black folk. This is just a partial list. Okay, we're talking about things, you know, I mean, the post box, you know, just so many things. Toilet, guitar, I mean, just potato chips. The list is endless. The reason I put that in there is to have people realize that the people that came to America that were enslaved, they came with a high culture and education, and the idea that they brought their a very high culture and artistic culture, as well as conceptualizing things to make life better for them and their families. Next slide. In other words, they didn't bring any junk when they kidnapped us. This is a picture outside the museum at the mall, 1460 East Holt Avenue in Pomona, in the village at Indian Hill. Next slide. Okay, and this is a little bit that you can get information on the museum, and there's some symbols on there that I won't go over, but that leaves something for when you come and visit. So everyone is welcome, and I'm going to let Victoria do her thing, talk about some of the things that happened in the museum, and share with you that.
First, I'd like to say thank you, Cal Poly, for inviting us. We are Leos, but we're happy to be here. It was a big rivalry when we were at Laverne between Cal Poly. But no, we did for a minute. But I must say back then, the Black students, didn't matter if you were at the Claremont Colleges, Laverne, or Cal Poly, we all came together and shared lots of wonderful memories. I just want to share two things with you. One, Professor Hurd, that was wonderful, because children's should be their needs should be the center. And along with what Khalif said, our culture is very important. We raised 4 children, and whenever they did a project, it had to be African centered. If they were doing a project on California, one of our sons did the mission, but the city up north, Allensworth. So we always try to tie it in so that it was meaningful. And I think that is the key that's very important. As an elementary school teacher, I looked around my class, and whoever was in there, we celebrated everybody from Cinco de Mayo to Chinese New Year's, whatever the class was made up of. My children were key. And I always wanted to make sure that they knew that they were the center of what we did. So I just want to leave a couple ideas with you as parents and teachers that you might want to do. Right now, it's really important that children at home, and you want them reading books that look like them. I cannot stress how important that is. My grandsons, we were reading Harriet Tubman, but I couldn't get them to get in on the program with me, but they all had the book, so I did put it out there for them. So that's really crucial, and it's really, really important. Today I was on, I think it was Amazon, and there was a book, I Am Very Good, by Derek Barnes. I was like, wow, that was such a cool book. And it doesn't take a lot of energy to find books that look like our children. Amazon, you can go to Libby, Goodreads, Audible Reads. I mean, because our libraries are closed, we just have to be a little more creative about how to find these titles for our children. I would encourage our students, even adult, even college students, send a postcard to your grandma. I tell you, I get so excited when my grandkids send me a letter or a postcard. Using your writing skills, and plus it becomes emotional. It becomes emotional also. I would also encourage you to encourage your children to keep a diary. This is 2020, and this is an unusual time in history. Keeping a diary. They may, and I don't, from elementary to college, keep a diary. Record what is going on right now. I'd also like to suggest that for PE, it's so important to have our kids go outside. Go to 99 cent store, buy a jump rope, let them stand on the patio. They need to be outside. I'm just had an idea, and I'm talking with a friend who's a line dance teacher, and I'm trying to encourage him to do some type of online line dancing for kids. But PE is really, really important. We need to get our kids moving. For science, for math, they can go on the grocery store website, have them pick out your grocery list, get the total, get the cost, and say, okay, now I want you to go over there and now compare it to Stater Brothers or something like that. But get them engaged in what's going on. There are tons of science on Facebook, just tons of science experiments and programs that they can work on. And then finally, I want to share with you what we do at the museum. Because of COVID-19, we have been closed since March, but prior to that, we have what's called Soul Cinema, and we show documentaries, and we have the community come out and we get engaged, and really, it's really a special time because some of the documents are just phenomenal. Second, we're going to revisit Sankofa Reading Circle, and the children from the community come, all different kids come and they read, or I grab my girlfriends and they read, or teachers come and read, or grandmas come and read, and then we have a follow-up activity. So it's a way to incorporate African American culture to our children and to the community. Right now, we're in collaboration with Tri-City with a program called Healthy Scholars, and that's going to be going on during this time, and it will be a virtual program. So we are here for the community. We retired and we said, well, let's just have a little Black History program. So we thought we were just going to have just maybe 4 weeks. This was 10 years ago. We were just going to have like 6 weeks of Black History program for February, and now here we are 10 years later. So we've had to change because we had to learn about a business, outside the classroom. You're in the classroom, you got that down, but this was something different. And so we've had to change, and we've had so many wonderful people to believe in this vision. And it's not our museum. We really like to stress that. This is a community museum, and we want everybody to buy into it. People from all walks of life. I'm going to share this. We had a tour. We've had tours from preschoolers who want to touch everything, to high school students who come and sit, and the elders who come. And in fact, Dr. Bell came, and he's one of your former, I think, president, and he just had tears in his eyes because he was so touched by what he saw. But a little Mexican girl came in, and she went over to this exhibit. She said, "Oh, that's Rosa Parks. I studied about Rosa Parks." And my heart was just like full. I was like, yes, somebody, is doing that. But we want our children to have a vast and a more comprehensive understanding of the culture. And because we're in Pomona, it's everybody. It's not, you know, certainly we want our African American students to learn, but we want everybody to know what's going on. So we just are so happy that you invited us to come here. My friend Linda Earthly Fleming, I think she was a part of your organization. She kind of pulled our coat, and we're just happy to be here and hope that something has been said by both presentations that will encourage parents, teachers, and students to realize how important it is that we embrace each other, embrace and learn about each other's culture. So that's my 10 cents.
Mhm.
Do we have any questions in the chat box or any questions that anyone wants to ask verbally at the
I don't see any questions. We do have some comments saying that they love the features of the museum. It's so refreshing and encouraging deep down. Thank you for being an asset to the community at large. In response to Dr. Hurd's presentation, what a practical, powerful, and pertinent approach. So a lot of great comments. If anyone has a question or like to speak, we have just a few minutes left.
I would just stress to all those who are attending tonight that if you're trying to figure out students' voices, you have to give them opportunities to develop that voice. So allowing students to make mistakes in their efforts to learn what they're interested in. Some kids aren't going to know, regardless of their age, we're talking about K through 12 or college, until they're given the chance to explore what that might be. And what's important when you do that, please make sure you do it in opportunities where they can see people look like them. The founders of the museum were talking about finding books that are relevant for them. So for our household, it's finding books, and a lot of libraries have partnerships with other libraries where they can come in and you can share that. So for books like, you know, Jason Reynolds does a lot of books for kids and young adults. There's Children of Blood and Bone. So finding books that are relevant regardless of age groups that can offer powerful information that a student, regardless of age, may or may not be aware of is really important. But giving that trial and error and talking about it. Another thing that we didn't get a chance to go into is utilizing films, films that students are interested in, where they see themselves, and using that to create opportunities to talk and to create learning opportunities. Creating small group discussions is sometimes just as impactful as having a student write an essay.
All right, thank you very much. That concludes the event. I want to remind everyone that this is a recorded event. If you registered through Eventbrite, you will get an email letting you know the link to the recorded workshop, so you can share that with your colleagues. I want again to thank Professor Hurd III for another great presentation. I want to thank Khalif and Veronica for volunteering their time and letting us know about the museum and looking at the Afrocentric viewpoint of student-centered learning and letting us know about that history that has been lost and, you know, that we definitely need to reconnect with. I also want to give a shout out to the Black alumni of University of La Verne. I know there's probably some in here, and we see you guys networking, and we see you guys doing events. So if you ever want to connect and collab, definitely reach out, because like Veronica said, you know, we're such a small community on each university, and when we come together, great things can happen. Also, I want to thank the African American chapter of Cal Poly Alumni. And I also want to thank the alumni chapter of Cal Poly for participating in this event. Our next event so far scheduled is on October 22nd. We'll be talking about entering politics. We'll be having some of our alumni from Cal Poly Pomona that are currently in the political space, former mayors, and hopefully some commissioners. And so if you guys are interested in being civically engaged and running for office, October 22nd, please calendar that, and we will be sending out emails letting you know when that event is occurring so you can register for that, and then also share that with colleagues and friends because we definitely want to get more African Americans involved in civic engagement, running for office, and also voting. So again, thank you for everyone. Oh, and thank you for Book Talk. We also, if you are a Cal Poly alumni member, we will be having another book club September 20th. We'll be talking about Charles E. Cobb Jr.'s book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. It's a book analyzing self-defense and some of the organizations in the South that were using guns to protect those that were nonviolent. So there was the NAACP president in Tennessee. There was also organizations and local farmers and civilians in the South that were nonviolent, but definitely believed in their Second Amendment and having guns to protect them from the terrorism that was going through white supremacist groups in the South at that time. So please join us for that book. We'll be having a discussion going into depth, and especially with the timely events of the past week, talking about civil rights and social justice issues. It's going to be a very deep conversation. So again, thank you everyone for coming out, and we hope you guys stay safe, social distance, and definitely protect your mental space and your mental health. All right, you guys have a great night.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrea and Nicole.
And
Absolutely.
Corey.
And Corey and Professor Hurd III.
Nice.
I missed somebody. Who did I not say?
No.
Noel? I did. Yeah.
No, you said me. You're good. Thank you so much.
Okay. All right.
Everyone be safe.
Hi, Linda.
Hey, Linda.